Hello, folks, and welcome to the first video lecture in this semester of American Literature 2, Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, and American Poetry. So this lecture is going to mostly focus on two particular poets, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, but to give a quick um, contextualization, because this is the first lecture of the semester, American Literature 2 is a survey course, meaning it looks at a broad look at a historical period and national tradition rather than going fewer examples and more depth. We do a lot of examples, less depth. And American Literature 2 begins in 1865, which is, of course, the end of the US Civil War. As I hope you all learned before coming to this class, but I'll reiterate or iterate for the first time. The Civil War, the US Civil War was, of course, fought over the question of slavery. Um, First Carolina and then other southern states seceded from the United States, left the country, created the Confederate States precisely in order to preserve the legal right of white people to hold black people as enslaved people. Um, and so the end of the Civil War in 1865 marks a radical change in US history where an entire category of human beings gets legally recategorized from literal property to citizens. And that radical change in US history is often used in American university courses in English and in history as a dividing line between a pre and a post 1865 moment because of just how incredibly far reaching the changes to the country were in 1865. So our course begins in the late 19th century. So, as a reminder, the 1800s are the 19th century, the 1900s are the 20th century, and now the 2000s are the 21st century. So, our course, American Literature 2, begins in the latter decades of the 19th century, which is significant because the 19th century as an era is pointed to by American literary scholars, that is, scholars of American literature, wherever they are in the world. The 19th century is pointed to as the era in which something that is called American literature consolidates into a particular thing that is no longer simply European literature with new content. Um, and we'll talk about that as the semester goes on. But just keeping that in your head that the 19th century is when American literature as a distinct national literary tradition consolidates within its own right. Um, the emergence of American literature in the 19th century is a moment where some writers get credited with being particularly influential, two of whom we begin the semester with, Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. Dickinson and Whitman are two very different poets, but their different styles and their different personas um, are equally important to the development of a tradition of American poetry that is distinctly embedded within that American literary tradition. Um, and one of the extra reasons you'll see this third bullet point here on this slide that I'm starting with these poets has to do with Whitman himself, for whom the Civil War was an existential test of the United States itself. It was a test of democracy itself. And so Walt Whitman viewed the Civil War as the end of the Civil War as this moment of realization for the United States as a country. And so all of these things combine to make us so that our course begins in the 19th century and it begins with two equally incredibly influential poets who are very different people and have very different poetic technique. Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. So you're going to have two slides from me. This first slide is comparing them a little bit more biographically, and the next slide is going to compare their poetry. Um, Here you can see that Walt Whitman was a very self-consciously public figure, while Emily Dickinson was a very self-consciously private figure. Walt Whitman had limited formal education. He had worldly education. He was a man who traveled a lot, who had a lot of life experience, right? He was a writer, but he was also a nurse during the U.S. Civil War, as in he would travel around with soldiers and help doctors attend to wounds. And Whitman was very much like a poet of the people who walked amongst various different stratas of American society and had a lot of life experience. Dickinson had a formal higher education experience in a women's college in multiple different languages and different disciplines and different arts, and so she's drawing on more formal education in when she's writing her poetry. Back to the self-consciously public versus private. Whitman was someone who, during his time, wanted to be famous. He actively courted fame. He signed his name to his poems, to his essays. He wrote a ton, so he was super prolific, and explicitly had the goal. He wanted to be the writer who wrote the great American poem. Um, in contrast, Dickinson was self-consciously private. Now, that doesn't mean she was a recluse. There's a kind of popular imagination of Emily Dickinson that is really oversimplifying and kind of sexist, that imagines her as this like poor, frail lady who stays in her bedroom and doesn't venture out into public. Like Emily Dickinson had friends who she would like to go and visit. She was active in some literary circles. She was a prolific exchanger of letters with people across um, society in New England where she was, um, but she was private. She actively didn't want to be famous, and you'll see the last bullet on the Emily Dickinson side. Her poems were published posthumously, meaning after she died. She actually actively didn't want to be a famous poet, in contrast to Whitman, who wanted to be famous. Um, so Dickinson was had a social life and was a person in the world, but when it came to herself as a writer, she kept her thoughts and her feelings fairly private. Both Whitman and Dickinson are queer writers. Whitman very explicitly in his poetry writes about um, loving, admiring, and being attracted to men. He has a whole section of poems called the Calamus poems in his famous book Leaves of Grass that's completely dedicated to love between men. And because Whitman's poetry is so like on the surface obvious about writing about queer desire and queer love, Whitman is completely like uncontroversially widely acknowledged to be a queer poet. No one who needs to be taken seriously argues that Whitman wasn't queer. In contrast, because Dickinson lived a more private life, the evidence of her queerness it really appears vividly in her private letters to other women, most specifically one particular woman, I believe, her sister-in-law, so her brother, not her blood sister, but sister-in-law, right? You're not blood related to your in-laws. Um, and she, in these private letters, expresses um, what we would today like recognize as desire or love for women. But because she doesn't explicitly say things like that in her poetry, and her poetry was itself not published widely or at all in her lifetime, some scholars, usually older generations of scholars, would call it more controversial to claim that Dickinson is queer. More contemporary scholars like myself don't think it's controversial at all to claim Dickinson as a queer writer. Her private letters, which have been like preserved over time, and which people have worked really hard to preserve, like clearly demonstrate a woman who loved at least one other woman in her life, if not other women besides that. So that's just relevant for these two who are two of uncontroversially considered two of the most important poets of 19th century American literary history. And because the 19th century is when American poetics and American literature consolidates as something coherent, they are also both, therefore, two of the most important poets, period, in American literary history. And they both just happen to, by chance, be queer. So it's important to note that while they're both equally important, one of the cool things about studying them side by side is you can see how different they are as poets, how different their poetry is in style. So both Whitman and Dickinson make use of the lyric. Lyric poetry is poetry that expresses the interiority of the subject, so your inner thoughts, your inner feelings, through the pronoun I. So the lyric I, the singular subject that projects its interiority through the poem. Whitman tends to do so in various kinds of lengths, but has a certain penchant for the long, epic lyric poem. Whereas Dickinson, I write lyric concision because Dickinson is is much more concise in her poetry. Sure, her poems are shorter and more precise. You can think of like Whitman more like a machete and Dickinson more like a scalpel. Whitman clears space for a new American literary tradition. Dickinson takes a scalpel to make precise interventions, right? Whitman makes use famously of catalog, anaphora, and song. So working backwards, a lot of his poems have a kind of musical quality to the rhythm, which you'll hear when I read some poems out loud later in this lecture. Um, anaphora is a fancy word for repeating phrases over across a poem. So Whitman is pretty well known to repeat a phrase. I am a poet of the blank. I am a poet of the blank. I'm a poet of the workers. I am a poet of the bankers. I'm a poet of the sailors. I'm a poet of, like repeating the I'm a poet of over and over and over again in a poem in order to catch your ear with emphasis, but also to demonstrate similarity and difference, right? And then catalog is like basically using the list form in a poem, um, where like have a poem where he talks about walking down the city street and all the different people he sees. That list of people he sees is catalog. So that's like signature Whitman stuff. A signature Dickinson thing is that she uses very deliberate pacing. So not that Whitman doesn't use deliberate pacing, but Whitman can sometimes kind of get a little winded or a little big, and it seems like he's just kind of going. He's not being deliberate, but it's his pacing isn't as important, whereas Dickinson is so deliberate in where she starts and stops ideas and rhythms. She is most famous as a poet who uses M dashes. Dickinson is the queen of M dashes. Long before the 21st century, where people were saying things like, if you see a bunch of M dashes, it was written by AI. No, Emily Dickinson is the queen of the M dash. She uses them all the time. And two vocab words that you should have for Dickinson's poems are caesura and enjambment. Caesura refers to a gap or yeah, like a gap or an opening in an idea. So she will often leave an idea open at the end of a line and only come back to it later. Enjambment is a word to describe what happens at the end of a line of poetry that makes lines of poetry different from sentences in a paragraph. So in prose writing, you have paragraphs and paragraphs have sentences. In poems, poems do not have paragraphs. Poems do not have sentences. Poems have stanzas, which are like paragraphs, and they have lines, which make up stanzas. The thing about lines of poetry, though, is that grammatically they can be broken rather than having to go from beginning to end. Enjambment is a fancy word to describe when a string of words that outside of a poem could be a sentence gets cut before you get to the end of the sentence so that it appears on different lines. So enjambment is how you cut your lines. Caesura is a specific thing where you have a gap in your idea that you're expressing. Um, Both Whitman and Dickinson believe in the existence of a soul, but both believe that the body is also important. So I'll start with Whitman. Whitman, it says body and soul on the left. What is important there is that what Whitman does that is significant for American literary history is he goes against the inherited tradition of European poetry, which is influenced by Christianity, which places the soul above the body. So soul is closer to God, soul is clean, and it's the more advanced thing. The body is closer to earth, the body is dirty, the body sins, and so the body is less important in a lot of the kind of Christian theology that was influencing European poetry. Whitman doesn't reject the soul. Instead, what he does is he brings the soul down and he elevates the body up so that they're even. For Whitman, the body is holy and the soul is in the body. They are not, there is no hierarchy for Whitman. That's what's significant and what he does that makes that makes a change to the traditions that he inherited. Dickinson mixes a sense of religion, more explicit religion than Whitman, who is talking about souls but is less concerned with a specific religion. Dickinson will mix religious reference with sometimes eroticism, which gives us some of the reason why Dickinson is sometimes not seen as queer because the erotics in her poetry is more subtle, more coded, more mixed with things that we wouldn't consider erotic. And so that's why Dickinson is often less confidently talked about in terms of her queerness. It's also because of the way that both Whitman and Dickinson very differently express sensuality. For Whitman, sensuality is raw, it's in the body. He writes about how he writes viscerally about the body. Bodies smell, bodies sweat, bodies taste. Um, for him, in his poetry, sensuality happens through the images of bodies actually being intimate sometimes, kissing cheeks, caressing arms, right? Like his poetry is very much like the sensuality is right there. Dickinson, however, uses imagistic sensuality, meaning she gets at sensuality through key images, like I'm going to read a poem later where she uses a hummingbird as an avenue through which to express erotics. You'll see what that means when we get to the poem. And then finally, Whitman is very famous for being a poet who mostly doesn't use regular rhyme or meter. Mostly, not exclusively, mostly Whitman rejects a regular rhyme scheme. He also changes up meter throughout his poems. It is this kind of like movement towards what we might today call free verse um, that makes Whitman such a influential and distinct poet of the 19th century that helps inaugurate an American poetic style. Dickinson plays with rhyme and half rhyme. So half rhyme is when you have um, and I'll point it out. I'll instead of trying to go off the top of my head, I will point out half rhyme in one of the Dickinson poems I read. But basically, it's the idea that like two words that almost sound the same, but they're not quite a full rhyme. They're almost a rhyme. So okay, so for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to read some poems by Whitman and Dickinson out loud. So because when you read poetry as students, poetry is meant to be read out loud. You want to hear the poem. Um, and so I'm going to read the poems out loud. I might say a thing or two about them, but mostly I just want you to hear poetry being read. Okay? So this first one is a poem by Walt Whitman about the U.S. Civil War. It's called Reconciliation. This is about the end of the Civil War. Word over all, beautiful as the sky, beautiful that war and all its deeds of carnage must in time be utterly lost, that the hands of the sisters death and night incessantly softly wash again and ever again this soiled world. For my enemy is dead, a man divine as myself is dead. I look where he lies white-faced and still in the coffin. I draw near, bend down, and touch lightly with my lips the white face in the coffin. And this poem is an expression of how Whitman sees the end of the Civil War as this moment of coming together, North and South, who he sees as equally divine. Um, and this is part of where Whitman gets criticized for his lack of real analysis of racism, because to Whitman, the North and the South are equals, but of course we know that like the U.S. Civil War was a war where one side was right and one side was wrong morally. Slavery is morally wrong, and the South was fighting to preserve slavery. That the fighting for the cause of preserving slavery is not the equivalent of the Northern cause to reconcile the nation. So I share that poem to say Whitman is a incredibly influential poet, one of my personal favorite poets, and not a, but he is also a poet with his issues that we need to discuss. Second poem from Whitman. This one is I'm sharing because I want you to hear the musicality of it. It almost sounds like a song. This is a poem about the death of Abraham Lincoln. So the captain in "Oh Captain, My Captain" is Abraham Lincoln. Oh, Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near. The bells I hear. The people all exulting, while follow eyes in the steady keel. The vessel grim and daring. But oh, heart, heart, heart! Oh, the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my Captain lies, fallen dark and dead. Oh, Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up for you, the flag is flung for you, the bugle trills. For you, bouquets and ribbon wreaths, for you, the shores are crowding. For you, they call the swaying mast, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, all shores, and ring, O bells! But I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain lies, fallen, cold, and dead. I'm not going to say anything about that other than I want you to hear the music of it. Two really short poems by Dickinson. These are two. The one on the left, "I'm Nobody, Who Are You?" Super famous Dickinson poem, and I share it because you can kind of hear how this poem is like egging on someone like Walt Whitman. Um, "I'm nobody. Who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'd advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog, to tell one's name the lifelong June to an admiring bog." Um, Yeah, and then on the right is one of my favorite Dickinson poems, "Tell the Truth but Tell It Slant." Tell all the truth but tell it slant, success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. And here last two poems before we take this lecture to a close. These two poems are two of the better known Dickinson poems that start to get at this kind of oblique or uh, subtle or discreet um, expressions of eroticism or sensuality or queerness. So, Wild Nights, Wild Nights. Wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart in port, done with the compass, done with the chart, rowing in Eden, ah, the sea, might I but more tonight in thee. And then one of my favorite Dickinson poems on the right. All the letters I could write were not fair as this, syllables of velvet, sentences of plush, depths of ruby undrained. Hip, lip for thee, play it were a hummingbird, and sipped just me. And sipped just me. Chills every time. First question for you for your lecture response this week. What do you make of ending a poem with an M dash? That's that's intense. What do you make of ending a poem with an M dash? Talk about either this one or Tell the Truth but Tell It Slant, and or both, and tell and write a little bit about what you think about ending a poem with an M dash. All right, quick takeaways. The Civil War was central to the formation of American literature for reasons I said at the beginning of the lecture. Whitman and Dickinson signal a solidification of American literature, specifically and significantly through poetry, as a distinct national literature, and they do it through distinct styles. Form and content both matter when reading poetry. It's not just what do the words mean, it's also what is the form of the poem, what is the shape of the poem, what are the techniques of the poem, right? And then your last thing to think about for today, how did two queer poets become the quintessential foundational American poets? So a question for you to answer in your lecture response without really one definitive answer is, what do you make of the fact that two of the most important poets in American history, uncontroversially, like no one argues that Dickinson and Whitman wouldn't be two of the most important poets because of the things about their style that they contributed. And they both happen to be queer poets, but not that in a way that not everyone acknowledges. So I'd love for you to write for your second lecture response question. Um, just some thoughts on that general idea of these two poets. So thank you so much for your time, and that was the first lecture of American Literature 2 for this semester.